salvation of an individual, but election alone does not save, unquote. What nonsense! Of course election alone saves. If an individual is elected, he's automatically saved. How could someone be elected while simultaneously be lost? That's a contradiction in terms. If he's lost, then he wasn't if he's lost, then he wasn't elected. And if he was elected, he couldn't have been lost. On page 315, Ryrie struggles with this problem even more by providing the following illustrations. He says, does God know the day you're going to die? The answer is yes, He does. Question, could you die a day sooner? The answer is no. Question, why do you eat? Answer, to live. Suppose I do not eat, then I will die. Would that be the day God planned that I should die? These are questions that do not need to be asked or answered. Just eat, unquote. Oh yes, they do need to be asked and answered, because they go to the heart of this gobbledygook. Ryrie seeks to dodge the problem and proceed to other matters because he knows there is no answer. And finally, on the same page, he states, quote, does God know who are the elect? Of course, He elected them. Can any of them be lost? No. Then why pray and witness? Because that's how they would be saved, unquote. What? How can that be true? That's not how they would be saved. They were already saved when they were elected. Ryrie continues, will any of them fail to believe? No. Then why do they have to believe? Because that is the only way they will be saved. And unless they do believe, they will not be saved, unquote. Again, false and more gobbledygook for the pile. Their salvation has already been fixed, and what they believe is irrelevant. Ryrie concludes by saying, do not let your mind ask the theoretical and useless questions, unquote. In other words, don't think. Just listen and believe, and above all, don't dwell on this problem. It's a good source for tangled thought processes and migraine headaches. But then, didn't Ryrie admit earlier that faith takes off where reason ends? On page 254, in the book entitled Dr. Rice, Here Is My Question, apologist John R. Rice was asked to explain predestination and immediately leaped into the swamp by saying, predestination is taught in Romans 8:28-29 and simply means that God knows ahead of time who will trust Him, unquote. Wrong, wrong. He doesn't just know ahead of time. He determines it. It's His idea. That's a big difference. On page 141, in the book entitled The Bible Has the Answer, apologists Morris and Clark confront the same problem and show that the Bible does not have the answer by saying, it is not contradictory, therefore, but rather complementary, to hold that man determines his own decisions and actions, and yet also to recognize that God, in some inscrutable way, has foreordained those very things. Although admitting that we cannot fully understand this paradox, we accept both aspects of it by faith and then act accordingly, trusting God to make it all clear in eternity, unquote. Oh, brother. Nearly every time bibicists face one of these major contradictions for which they have no sensible reply, they tell us God will provide an answer in the great beyond. Talk about blind, unquestioning adherence to a blatant contradiction. This is it. we can see that faith is a realm beyond reason into which people seek to escape. The word paradox is nothing more than a euphemism for a massive contradiction. Apologist Barry Wood not only adds to all of this mess by saying on page 116 in the book entitled Questions Non-Christians Ask, quote, "Everything Paul says about predestination applies only to those who are already saved. The Bible nowhere says the lost person is predestined to go to heaven or hell," unquote. Utterly false. Obviously, everyone must be predestined either to heaven or hell, since there's no third option. And unless everybody is predestined to go to heaven, some must be predestined to go to hell. Moreover, can Wood provide scriptural support for his allegation that predestination only applies to those who are saved? Later on page 117, he says, "How do you leave room for man's free will to accept or reject God's call? We must admit this is a difficult thing to understand. Just read Romans 9 through 11 and see if Paul understands it." He didn't. He was left with a paradox, unquote. There's that word again. Don't be deceptive, Barry. It's impossible. It's not difficult to understand. It's impossible to comprehend. And that's why Paul's position is so chaotic. Wood admits that Paul doesn't understand it. And Wood concludes by saying on page 119, "I know this is a mind bender." That's an understatement if ever there was one. Every contradiction is a mind bender, and this is one of the bendiest. One of the clearest admissions that the Bible teaches predestination is found on page 281 in the book entitled Today's Handbook for Solving Bible Difficulties, in which Christian spokesman David O'Brien says, quote, using one of the simplest rules of interpretation, the clearest and simplest reading of Romans 9 is that God predestines, and those who are predestined play no active part in the divine decree. As a lifelong Arminian, an Arminian is one that believes in free will, it grieves me to admit this, but that's the simplest reading of the text. Read this way, Paul is presenting a picture of God making decisions that please Him for reasons that only He can know or understand, and carrying out those decisions without the consent, cooperation, or resistance of the people involved. Unquote O'Brien. All O'Brien is saying is that the behavior of everything and everybody was fixed from the beginning, and people are only acting out a predetermined scenario written by God. And if that isn't injustice in action and a blatant refutation of Deuteronomy 32:4, which says God is just, I don't know what is. That completes our presentation. And please join us later for the 68th edition of Biblical Errancy Commentary, when we'll continue showing why the Bible is nothing more than the flawed composition of some fallible human beings. Thank you for listening.